Something strange happened now that I am about to retire and stop preaching in this particular way. I discovered both peace and reconciliation with the story of the Transfiguration. After all these years, 4.5 decades of contention and snarling struggle and just general grumpiness on my part, went up in a midst of something that feels much more like Mary Oliver's slow climb and peace in the canopy of trees as in that poem. You see, or should I say, as you probably know by now, I have always considered this story, the Transfiguration, as one of the hard sells when it comes to sharing our spiritual wisdom. I mean, the average bloke on the street imagines that we Christians, church people, whatever, insist otherwise rational human beings swallow this story intact, literally, as if it happened just as it reads. And of course, that's because there are plenty of religion stores out there that just do that, demand literalism. In my church in Buffalo, the scene of the Transfiguration story was blasted on a 35-foot high Lafarge and maybe Tiffany collaborated, I don't remember, window that was behind the pulpit and behind the altar. So Moses and Elijah and Jesus were looking over my shoulder all the time. Like Jesus walking on the water, these stories erode the credibility of Christian spiritual wisdom within the world that we live in, rather than bolster it as they may have done some millennium ago. So as a preacher, I always felt as though I was doing battle with such stories as today's Transfiguration story. But not this time. You'll see what I mean. This story from Luke is the gospel trailer, like a movie trailer. It tells us in one little snippet what the whole gospel is about. Jesus is a superstar, and among the great, Jesus is a superstar in the league of spiritual superheroes, and among the greatest of them. In fact, Jesus is the greatest among them. He's Superman, not Batman, Wolverine, or the Green Hornet. This story of the Transfiguration appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and mostly remains the same story in all three. So, for example, in all three of those Gospels, it is placed right after Jesus says that those standing there with him, or some of those standing there with him, will see the coming of the kingdom. And then poof, Peter, James, and John go up the mountain and witness Jesus transformed. Now, it's a designer story, and one of the ways that we can tell that is the number of Old Testament allusions in it. Exodus 24, Psalm 2, Deuteronomy 18, and then Luke has a special one. Luke writes, "Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to Jesus. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure." Now, Mark and Matthew do not tell us what those three great prophets were talking about. Only Luke says that they were discussing Jesus' departure. And the exact word that Luke uses for departure is exodus. They were discussing Jesus' exodus. So we have several possibilities here, two of which seem most obvious to me. First, the story captures an actual historic moment when something freakishly supernatural happened and the three knuckle-headed disciples were there to witness it. Or, and more likely possibility, is that this is a manufactured story, a piece of theological propaganda designed to compete with mainstream Jewish thinking. Our guy is as great as your guys, and in fact, he's even more super. But I'm interested in the elements of these two stories and that Mary Oliver poem. They are what melted my animosity toward the Transfiguration now that I'm retiring. First, bright, brilliant light, in which reality is unveiled, and so everything can be seen as it actually is. Then there's the descent of a cloud of unknowing, shrouding the moment and taking away all light, the removal of all that has been seen in order to hear the voice that is rarely, if ever, heard. And of course, the mountain itself. Now, as Mary Oliver points out, it isn't a specific mountain, it is the heights, the rising above and the seeing. All urgency drained from any moment, all artificial light disappearing below the mist, looking back and forgiving all, and knowing the last thing there is to know. Only high places deliver such moments, and perhaps the oceans too, and maybe even sitting down beneath a pine tum in the silence of a small kingdom of conifers. But they are all rare moments, and we have to go looking for them in places that strip from us all sense of urgency and all busyness and anger and resentment and hostility and all such music of our own self-orbiting. You see, and I know you do, once we know the God of all that is, we also know what it is to be known completely, to be known, to be fully known. Moses has to wear a veil because others could not stand to know him so clearly, so truthfully, so utterly without pretense. And it reminds me of that old C.S. Lewis novel. Lewis wove this profound notion into his novel, The Great Divorce. Hell was not as Dante imagined in this novel. Rather, it is a vast wasteland of gray and drizzle in which its inhabitants cannot discern reality. In this gray city that Lewis imagines, they constantly bicker and blame each other and so live in isolation and without community. Part of this is because they cannot truly experience anything. They have desires, but when they're able to feel or consume what they desire, they cannot really experience it. So they are forever unfulfilled. This is in contrast with the Golden City, in which everything is so real that it can be overwhelming. To live in the Golden City, one must be able to bear the fullness of reality, an unveiled brilliance of total light. Now, the protagonist comes upon an apple orchard and has in mind to take some apples and bring them back and sell them in the gray city. But every apple is so heavy, being completely what it is and all that it is, that even the smallest apple in his hands doubles him over with its weight. Here's a great description as told by an angel in the story observing this poor human being. Lewis writes, "I could hardly help admiring this unhappy creature when I saw him rise, staggering to his feet, actually holding the smallest of the apples in his hands. He was lame from its hurts, and the weight bent him double. Yet even so, Inch by inch, still availing himself of every scrap of cover, he set out on his mission, carrying his torture. And of course, that small apple was only his torture because he discovered evil in what was actually innocent. Golden apples hanging there for joy. But for him, it was not taken, but it was taken rather, not received. It was for sale, not for sharing. It was concealed, not revealed. This is our dilemma. We want to know, really know, but when we see, really see, we want the veil put back. I feel a little silly, I must admit, being so philosophical today, but these stories, these very ancient stories, meant to tell us stuff about ourselves, as much if not more than to tell us about God. Take that Exodus story. Before the part we heard today, God kind of stuffs Moses into a crack in the rocks and covers his face with God's hand, because to see God is to die. The teeniest, tiniest fragment of a part cannot behold the whole in which it is lodged. So God deposits Moses into a crevice in the mountain and tells him not to look as God passes by. But of course, being human, Moses does look. But he only sees the arse of God, the backside, it says. But even that little peak utterly transforms Moses, and he will never be the same. Now, these two Bible stories today are reminding us of who we are. Small, pitiful creatures. Pitiful not because we are by nature evil or sinful or any other such nonsense, but because we imagine we are capable of knowing more than we can know, and of seeing more than we can see, and of making more than we can make, without also destroying ourselves and the earth for which we are stewards. Once we know the God of all that is, we also know what it is to be known completely. And standing there in that light, we see ourselves. We see ourselves as we truly are, in all our grandeur and silliness, in all our wisdom and pretense, in all our shame and hopefulness. No veil, no fog, no artificial light. And in that moment, if we can stand it, we discover that rather than being condemned or judged or ridiculed for what we are not, we are loved for who we are. Dang, it turns out I like that story a lot. Thanks for being here, and peace be with you.